Going through these Doctors Without Borders excerpts, it really struck me. It's more than just medical missions, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about these global ideals, like colliding with very, very local realities.
It's interesting how MSF, even though they aim for that Without Borders thing, they're always having to adapt,
Right.
to specific cultures, the politics, you name it, of wherever they are, the stuff you shared about their work in conflict zones. I mean, it really shows that tension.
Yeah, it's really telling. They're in places a lot of organizations really can't or won't go, but this whole universal approach bumping up against reality.
Mm-hmm.
Got an example from this material that really makes it hit home.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So one excerpt talked about how their standard emergency kit, which makes sense, it's for efficiency, right? But sometimes it's just not enough.
Yeah.
Like in one case, they didn't have the right meds for local illness, forced some tough choices about who got treatment, really challenged that whole impartiality thing.
It's such a concrete example. It's easy to say medical care for everyone on paper.
Yeah.
Then you've got limited resources, unique needs. Just, wow. Those decisions on the ground are a whole other level.
And it goes beyond just logistics, too. The research you had, there were situations where MSF, they wrestled with the after effects of their own actions,
Unintended consequences.
Exactly, yeah. Like providing free care in one place actually put local clinics out of business.
Wow.
They couldn't compete.
So even with good intentions, there's a ripple effect.
Yeah.
Solve one problem,
Yeah.
create another. Did the excerpts talk about how MSF handles those kinds of situations?
They did. They highlighted how MSF is trying to learn from these situations. They talk about increasing partnerships with local healthcare providers, putting more into training, and they're finding ways to strengthen what's already there instead of accidentally replacing them.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Shifting from just aid to empowerment. That feels big for long-term impact.
Yeah. Huge. And it actually links to something else from your research, that whole internal culture at MSF, how they deal with this culture of volunteering. The excerpt suggests that dedication, it's admirable, but it can lead to burnout. High turnover rates, too.
Yeah. Like any field, passion can only get you so far.
Yeah.
Constantly surrounded by suffering. I mean, without the right support, it's going to take a toll.
Exactly. One former worker even said they felt like they were running on fumes, driven by the work, but neglecting their own well-being. It's something they're trying to deal with.
It's a good reminder, even with an organization as, respected as MSF, you've got the human element, individuals with limits.
For sure. And that human element plays into how they handle the political side of things, too. The excerpts about conflict zones really highlight that.
Just being in those places is risky. How do they deal with pressure from governments or factions or whoever who might see them as a problem?
It's this whole intricate dance. They describe it in the research. MSF sticks to neutrality, providing care regardless of affiliation, but they have to negotiate access, get permits, and sometimes they even have to pull out temporarily, if it gets too dangerous.
A constant risk-reward calculation.
Yeah, and it goes deeper, too.
Yeah.
The excerpts get into this internal debate within MSF about whether to speak out against the human rights abuses they see.
Oh, wow.
Silence might be the key to access, but it goes against their principles.
It's that classic thing. Do you speak truth to power, even if it costs you? Did the excerpts give any clues about how they navigate that? That's a tough one.
It seems like they approach it from different angles, depending. In some instances, they'll work things out quietly, behind the scenes with authorities. Other times, they've gone public, shine a light on abuses, even if it meant they might be kicked out.
Wow. It's going to be a tough call every time. And speaking of internal stuff, the excerpts got into something I found really interesting. How individuals' viewpoints play a role within MSF. Like, it's not just this big machine, right? It's people. And their own experiences are shaping the decisions they make.
That's a great point. They actually looked at how two different coordinators facing pretty similar situations out in the field ended up making completely different calls on, resource allocation. One went all in on building a strong relationship with local authorities. The other focused on giving more power to local staff.
So even with MSF's structure, their protocols,
yeah,
there's room for interpretation. Personal values are going to come into play.
Exactly. And it all ties into this tension between MSF trying to standardize things, like with the emergency kits, protocols, that kind of stuff, and then the reality that they have to adapt to each unique situation.
Constantly pushing and pulling. Being ready for anything, but then also got to be responsive to the unexpected. Which, honestly, that's kind of humanitarian aid in a nutshell, isn't it?
It really is. And you see that tension, too, in how they think about dependency. Like, they don't want to create a situation where people are reliant on outside help.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
You want to help, but not in a way that makes it harder for communities to be independent in the long run.
Right, and they actually studied this. When MSF pulled out of one region after things were good, the problems they'd solved, they came back. Underlined how important it is to find solutions that last, where communities can take care of themselves.
It's more than just showing up with aid and then leaving.
Yeah.
That long-term impact.
Yeah.
Making sure it's sustainable.
Absolutely. And this gets to something else that's really complex ethically. I mean, and the excerpts brought this up too. What happens when you provide care that's life-saving, but the social and economic problems, the things that are causing the suffering in the first place, what if those aren't addressed?
Yeah. It's like treating the symptoms, but not the root cause.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly. One example they gave was after a huge earthquake. MSF provided emergency care, saved tons of lives, but they knew. The poverty, the lack of infrastructure, it made that community so vulnerable to future disasters.
So what do you even do in that situation? You got to provide the immediate aid, but how do you reconcile that with the bigger picture?
It's an ongoing thing for them, that's for sure. The research suggests they're really grappling with this. They're doing more advocacy work now, pushing for policies to change and partnering with other organizations to tackle those bigger social determinants of health.
So they're leveraging what they have, their platform, their expertise, to not just treat what they see, but to prevent those things from happening again.
Yeah, and when they start advocating, well, that brings them into contact with governments, authorities, and that adds a whole other layer of complexity. It's about keeping their neutrality, their independence.
Right.
But they have to work within that political landscape. They need access, permits, sometimes even support.
It's a tightrope walk. How do you stay true to your principles when you have to work within a system that might not share those same values?
And the research had this really insightful case. MSF was trying to get into a conflict zone, and the government was basically blocking them.
Oh, wow.
They decided to go public. They knew it might hurt their relationship, but they felt they had to make sure people got help.
That's a gutsy move. To
Yeah.
stand up to power,
Yeah.
knowing there might be consequences.
It really shows how committed they are to their mission.
Absolutely.
And it goes beyond just governments. The research also looks at the relationship with local staff, which is interesting, right?
We've been talking about the international side of things,
Yeah.
but I mean, MSF relies on people from the communities they're helping. It's crucial.
Right, and they highlight both the good and the bad of that dynamic. Local staff, they bring so much cultural understanding, language, connections to the community, but there are power dynamics to consider, cultural differences, even language barriers sometimes.
Bridging those gaps. Building trust.
Mm-hmm.
Making sure everyone's treated fairly. Did the research talk about how they handle that?
They mentioned things like making sure the pay is fair, giving professional development opportunities, and creating decision-making processes that are inclusive. But there were definitely stories from local staff who were frustrated, like they felt their opinions weren't valued as much, or there were limits to how far they could go in their careers.
Sounds like they're still figuring it out, like any organization that's trying to do right by everyone.
It shows how all these internal things, whether it's different cultures, that culture of volunteering, even just treating local staff fairly, it all factors into the work they do.
Another reminder that even with an organization as, well, respected as MSF, there's still things to work on.
Absolutely. And it's those very complexities that make their work so challenging, but also so important.
It's interesting reading through these excerpts. You start to see what makes someone want to do this kind of work.
Yeah, it's not for everyone, that's for sure. The first-hand accounts really show that. It seems like MSF attracts people with a really strong sense of purpose, people who want to see their impact, really make a difference.
You can feel that commitment in what they're saying, but we keep coming back to this. It takes a toll. The excerpts didn't shy away from that, the emotional weight, the burnout, the sacrifices people make.
One doctor talked about their time in a war zone. Just intense doesn't even cover it. Overwhelmed by how many patients they had, how bad the injuries were, and the constant fear of, being shelled. They said even with their training, it changed them deeply.
Makes you wonder how anyone can do that kind of work long term.
It's a good question. It's something MSF is trying to address, it seems. They mention things like mental health support, work-life balance, trying to get at those root causes of burnout.
It's easy to forget when you're focused on helping other people. Got to take care of yourself, too.
Exactly. And that carries over to how they treat local staff, too. The research talked about how important it is for them to build true partnerships.
That really stuck with me, too. Not coming in with that savior attitude, working alongside communities, recognizing their expertise.
There was one project where they worked with midwives, local midwives, to make things better for mothers and babies. It was really successful. And they said it was because MSF really listened. They were willing to learn from these midwives, from their understanding of what that community really needed.
That's a great example of how aid should work.
Yeah.
Mutual respect, collaboration, local knowledge is so important.
It all comes back to what we've been talking about. Cultural sensitivity, adapting to the situation, empowering communities to help themselves.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive here into the world of Doctors Without Borders, what are we left with? What should our listeners take away from all this?
Well, I think we see a really complex picture, don't we? An organization trying to live up to its ideals in a world that is messy. It shows the successes, the struggles, and it reminds us there are no easy answers in this line of work.
It makes you want to understand more, but also to think critically. They're doing important work, but there are still challenges.
Yeah.
For MSF and for humanitarian aid as a whole.
And maybe the biggest thing is, beyond all the numbers and the headlines, these are real people. The ones giving aid and the ones receiving it. They have stories, motivations. It's complicated. And when we try to understand those individual experiences, that's how we really get what this work is all about.
That's a great point. And for anyone listening who wants to learn more, I'd say, seek out those stories. Wrestle with those tough questions. Really think critically about all these things we've been discussing. It's worth it.